I don't even know where to start because the weight of what I've done has been pressing down on me, suffocating every moment of clarity. It's like a storm I can't escape, swirling with guilt, confusion, and the desperate need to unburden myself. I know how this might look from the outside, simple, black and white, but it never is. Life isn't like that. And if I had known how deeply I would fall into this abyss, I would have stopped before it even began. But life has a way of pulling you into currents you never thought you'd be caught in, and by the time you realize you're drowning, it's too late. For me, it began innocently, during the holidays 2 years ago. My daughter Ellie had brought her husband Lared home for Christmas. They had been married for only 6 months, and I couldn't have been happier for her. Lared was charming and attentive to Ellie in ways that made me proud as her mother. But beneath all the holiday cheer, there was an undertow, a subtle, almost imperceptible current that would change everything. At first, I thought I was imagining things, brushing off the way his gaze lingered a second too long, or how his compliments seemed to carry a weight beyond politeness. I told myself I was reading too much into it, desperate to convince myself it was all in my head. But then, those fleeting moments started piling up. A touch on my hand as he passed a dish, a comment that felt a little too personal, a glance across the dinner table that left my heart pounding in ways I hadn't felt in years. The emotions were confusing, disorienting, and shameful. I kept questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was this all just an innocent misunderstanding, or was it the first tremor of an earthquake that would soon shatter everything I held dear? The more I tried to ignore it, the more undeniable it became. Lared had this way of seeing me, noticing things no one else did, not even my husband Tom. He picked up on my nervous habits, like how I twisted my wedding ring when I was anxious, or the little hums I made while cooking, things that made me feel seen, understood, and inexplicably vulnerable. Each interaction, however subtle, chipped away at my resolve, leaving cracks that I didn't know how to seal. I found myself dreading and craving his presence in equal measure. When he told me I was incredible on the last night of their visit, the floodgates of emotion opened, leaving me adrift in a sea of longing and guilt I didn't know how to navigate. After that first holiday visit, I thought the feelings would fade. I clung to the hope that once Lared and Ellie returned to their home, the unsettling emotions swirling inside me would disappear. But they didn't. Instead, they lingered, sneaking into quiet moments when I least expected it, while folding laundry, cooking dinner, or lying in bed next to Tom. I couldn't shake the memory of his words, his lingering glances, or the way his presence had ignited something inside me that had long been dormant. My mind kept replaying every subtle moment, dissecting them in search of answers. Was I imagining things, or had he truly seen me in a way I hadn't been seen in years? It started innocently enough. Shortly after the holidays, Lared sent me a text to thank me for hosting. His message was warm, polite, and harmless. I replied, thinking nothing of it. But then came another message. And another. At first he kept the conversation light, asking for Ellie's favorite recipes or seeking advice on what to get her for her birthday. But gradually our conversations deepened. His words began to peel back layers of vulnerability that I hadn't shared with anyone, not even Tom. He opened up about his own struggles, confiding that he sometimes felt like he wasn't enough for Ellie, that he feared failing her. In turn, I shared more than I should have, about the growing distance in my marriage, about how invisible I had felt for years. The more we talked, the more natural it felt, as if he was someone who understood me in ways I didn't even understand myself. His texts became a lifeline, little flashes of light that broke through the monotony of my days. I began to look forward to the buzz of my phone, the thrill of seeing his name on the screen. The shame of it was almost too much to bear, but the connection between us felt undeniable. There was an electricity in our conversations, a pull that I couldn't resist no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. I told myself that we were just talking, that there was no harm in exchanging a few messages. But deep down, I knew better. I knew the line we were walking was dangerous, that each message brought us closer to a point of no return. When I realized how much I was anticipating his texts, how his words had begun to fill a void I hadn't even realized was there, I should have stopped. I should have told him that this needed to end. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself be swept up in the current, each conversation leaving me more conflicted, more exhilarated, and more terrified of where this was leading. As the weeks turned into months, the boundaries between Lared and me grew fainter, dissolving under the weight of emotions we could no longer suppress. His texts became more frequent, and our conversations deepened in a way that left me both exhilarated and drowning in guilt. At first, I convinced myself that nothing was wrong. We were just talking. What harm could there be in that? But the truth was far messier, more dangerous. Each message felt like a secret shared in the dark, a thread tying us together in ways neither of us could fully explain. His words lingered in my mind long after I read them, replaying in quiet moments when I was alone, making my heart race in ways it hadn't in years. When Ellie and Lared came back for Easter, I tried to pretend everything was normal, but the air between us was charged with unspoken feelings. Every glance he cast my way felt like a spark, every accidental touch like a flame threatening to engulf me. I hated how much I noticed him, how his presence seemed to fill the room, how his every movement drew my attention. I was ashamed of myself, of the way my pulse quickened when he entered the kitchen or brushed past me in the hall. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the connection between us had become undeniable. One morning during their visit, I found myself alone in the kitchen, the house still quiet with sleep. As I poured coffee, trying to calm the restless storm in my chest, Lared appeared, his hair tousled, his t-shirt clinging to him in a way that made him look less like my son-in-law and more like something forbidden. His presence was magnetic, pulling me in despite every warning flashing in my mind. "Morning," he said softly, his voice low and tinged with something I couldn't place. I forced a smile, trying to focus on the coffee instead of the way my hands trembled. We stood there in silence for a moment, the air between us heavy with tension. Then, out of nowhere, he said it. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you." His words hung in the air, their weight almost unbearable. My heart raced, my mind spinning as I searched for a response that wouldn't betray the chaos inside me. "Lared, don't," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but he didn't stop. "I mean it," he said, stepping closer. "You're incredible." I should have walked away, ended it right there. But I didn't. Instead, I stood frozen, clutching the edge of the counter as his words sank into me, filling the empty spaces I hadn't even realized were there. It was the moment I knew I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into something that could destroy everything. And yet, I couldn't make myself step back. The weeks following Easter were like walking a tightrope, balancing on the edge of an abyss I couldn't seem to step away from. I thought the visit would bring some kind of clarity, that being face-to-face with Lared again would remind me of the impossibility of our situation. Instead, it had the opposite effect. His words, his presence, his attention, they all lingered with me long after they left. I found myself replaying the way he had looked at me in the kitchen that morning, the way his voice trembled when he told me I was incredible, as though he meant it with every fiber of his being. It was intoxicating and terrifying, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. When Lared texted me weeks later with a simple, "Can we talk?" my stomach twisted into knots. I knew I shouldn't respond, knew that even acknowledging his message would pull me deeper into this web we had spun. But the truth was, I wanted to talk. I wanted to hear his voice, to feel the way his words seemed to breathe life into the parts of me I had long thought forgotten. Against every shred of better judgment, I replied, "About what?" His answer came almost instantly. "About us." Those two words sent a shiver down my spine. Us. The very acknowledgement of something between us felt like crossing a line we'd been towing for months. "There is no us," I typed back, my fingers trembling as I pressed send. But even as I wrote the words, I didn't believe them. His response was immediate, his words cutting straight to the heart of everything I was afraid to admit. "Then why can't I stop thinking about you?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I should have ended it right there. I should have blocked his number, deleted the messages, and moved on with my life. But instead I typed out a response I knew I would regret. "I don't know, but I can't stop thinking about you either." With that message, the floodgates opened. What had been a simmering undercurrent of tension and longing now became a full-blown torrent, pulling us both into a place we couldn't come back from. From that point on, our conversations became more frequent, more intense, and more personal. Every message felt like a secret whispered in the dark, a betrayal wrapped in desire. I hated myself for how much I looked forward to hearing from him, for the way his words made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Yet, no matter how much I tried to fight it, the pull between us was stronger than my guilt, stronger than my fear, and stronger than any resolve I could muster. By the time summer arrived, the tangled web between Lared and me had become impossible to ignore. Every family gathering, every phone call with Ellie, every glance across a crowded room felt like a test of my crumbling self-control. And with each passing moment, the lines we had once sworn not to cross blurred further into nothingness. When Ellie and Lared invited Tom and me to their lake cabin for a weekend, my heart sank. I knew I should have made an excuse to stay home. Being around him, surrounded by the idyllic stillness of the lake, felt like an invitation to disaster. Yet, Tom was eager for a getaway, and I couldn't bring myself to deny him that simple happiness. So, I went, even as the knot in my stomach tightened with every mile closer we came to the cabin. The first night passed uneventfully. I forced myself into conversation with Ellie and Tom, smiling and laughing as if everything were normal. But beneath the surface, I felt the weight of Lared's presence in every breath. The way his eyes lingered just a moment too long when he looked at me, the faint touch of his hand brushing mine as he passed me a plate. Each small interaction sent my pulse racing. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting my guilt onto him. But deep down, I knew better. The second night was when everything unraveled. After everyone had gone to bed, I stepped out onto the deck, desperate for air. The lake was calm, the stars mirrored on its glassy surface, and the stillness of the night only amplified the storm within me. I stood there, gripping the railing, trying to quiet the chaos in my mind. Then I heard footsteps behind me, soft but unmistakable. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. "You couldn't sleep either?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to face him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Lared, you shouldn't be out here," I said, my voice trembling. "And yet here I am," he replied, his gaze locking onto mine. The air between us felt charged, electric, as if the night itself was holding its breath. "You can't keep doing this," I whispered, desperate to break the spell. But his next words shattered what little resolve I had left. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, stepping closer. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. The truth was, I did feel it. Every glance, every touch, every unspoken word between us had led to this moment. "This isn't about what I feel," I said, my voice cracking. "It's about Ellie, about Tom, about all the people we'll hurt." But even as I spoke, I felt the pull, the undeniable connection that had been building between us for months. And then, just as he reached out to touch my hand, the sound of the cabin door creaking open broke the spell. We both froze, turning to see Ellie standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft light from inside. "What are you two doing out here?" she asked, her voice groggy but laced with curiosity. My stomach dropped as panic surged through me. "Just getting some air," I said, forcing a smile and stepping back, desperate to put distance between us. Ellie yawned and nodded, disappearing back inside, but the damage had been done. The moment was over, and with it, the fragile illusion that we could keep this hidden forever. After the lake cabin weekend, The fragile world I had tried to maintain began to collapse under the weight of everything unsaid. The tension between Lared and me, so carefully hidden in the shadows, was now impossible to ignore. I told myself it was over, that Ellie's near discovery on the deck was the wake-up call we both needed. But even as I made that promise to myself, I felt the pull of his presence, the lingering echoes of the moments we had stolen. When my phone buzzed with his name a few weeks later, I knew I should have ignored it. I knew that responding would only drag us deeper into the mess we had created. But I couldn't help myself. "I can't do this anymore," his message read. My heart sank as I stared at the words, their meaning cutting through me like a blade. Was he saying he was done with us? Or was he confessing that he couldn't stay away? I typed out a dozen responses, each one feeling inadequate, before finally settling on the simplest one. "What do you mean?" His reply came instantly. "We need to talk. In person." I knew what that meant. I knew meeting him would be a mistake, that every step I took toward him was another step away from everything I had built with Tom and Ellie. But the thought of never seeing him again, of cutting off the connection that had somehow made me feel alive again, was unbearable. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The next day, I told Tom I had errands to run and drove to the coffee shop where everything had begun. When I walked in and saw Lared sitting at the corner table, his expression heavy with emotion, my breath caught in my throat. He looked up as I approached, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Desperation, longing, guilt. "Thanks for coming," he said softly as I sat down. "What's this about?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He hesitated, fidgeting with the edge of his coffee cup before finally looking up at me. "I can't keep living like this," he said. "The lies, the sneaking around, it's tearing me apart." His words hit me like a freight train, the weight of everything we'd done crashing down on me all at once. "It's tearing me apart too," I admitted, my voice trembling. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. "Then why can't we stop?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know why the pull between us was so strong, why I couldn't walk away even when I knew it was destroying me. All I knew was that we were trapped in a spiral we couldn't seem to escape, and with each passing moment, the cost of our actions grew heavier. As I sat there staring into his eyes, I realized that no matter how much we wanted to stop, the damage had already been done. And the hardest part was knowing that the worst was yet to come. It was a quiet evening when my phone rang, Ellie's name lighting up the screen. At first I didn't think much of it. She often called to check in or share the little details of her day. But as soon as I heard her voice, serious and measured, I knew something was wrong. "Mom," she said, her tone laced with unease, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." My heart skipped a beat, dread tightening in my chest. "Of course, sweetheart, what is it?" I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered. There was a long pause, the silence between us filled with my racing thoughts. When she finally spoke, her words hit me like a blow. "Is there something going on between you and Lared?" For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Time seemed to freeze as her question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My mind scrambled for a response, but all I could feel was panic and guilt threatening to consume me. "What are you talking about?" I managed to say, forcing a nervous laugh. "Why would you ask something like that?" "Don't play dumb, Mom," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and pain. "I've noticed the way you two act around each other, the looks, the tension. I thought I was imagining things, but now I'm not so sure." Her words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I gripped the phone. "You're imagining things," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of the lie. "There's nothing going on, Ellie. I promise." The silence on the other end was deafening, her doubt palpable even through the phone. "I really hope you're telling me the truth," she said quietly, "because if I ever find out otherwise—" She didn't finish her sentence, but the threat lingered in the air. When the call ended, I sat there in the stillness, the guilt crashing over me like a wave. I had lied to my daughter, the person I loved most in the world, to protect something that should have never existed in the first place. The shame was suffocating, and for the first time, I truly grasped the magnitude of what I had done. This wasn't just a fleeting mistake. It was a betrayal that could destroy my family. That conversation was a turning point. I knew I couldn't keep this up, couldn't continue lying to Ellie or myself. The weight of it all was too much to bear, and something had to give. But even as I resolved to end things with Lared, I couldn't shake the ache in my chest, the pull that had drawn me to him in the first place. It was as though I was caught in a storm, desperately trying to find my way out, but with every step, the winds only grew stronger. In the days following Ellie's call, I felt like I was living in a state of constant dread. Every glance she cast my way, every casual remark about her marriage felt like a test, a chance for her to uncover the truth I was so desperately trying to hide. The weight of my actions bore down on me, suffocating any moments of peace. The guilt was unrelenting, a shadow that followed me everywhere. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. But as much as I told myself it was time to end things with Lared, the thought of losing him left me feeling hollow and broken. When Lared and I finally met to talk, the reality of our situation came crashing down around us. We had arranged to meet in a quiet park, away from prying eyes, but even the serene surroundings couldn't ease the storm raging within me. As I approached him, sitting on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle: longing, regret, and the crushing knowledge of what this connection had cost me. He stood as I approached, his expression somber but resolute. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "We can't keep doing this, Lared," I said, the words catching in my throat. "It's destroying everything." He looked at me with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I know," he said softly, "but I can't just turn off how I feel. Can you?" The question struck me like a blow. Could I? I wanted to believe that I could walk away, that I had the strength to end this for good. But the truth was, I didn't know. "This isn't about what we feel," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about Ellie, about Tom, about the lives we're tearing apart." Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Lared's shoulders slumped, his usual confidence replaced by a vulnerability I had rarely seen. "I love her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't stop thinking about you." His confession was like a knife to my heart, cutting through the last shreds of my resolve. "This has to stop," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of my own words. "We've gone too far already." He nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek as he stepped back. "You're right," he said, his voice breaking. "But that doesn't make it any easier." I watched him walk away, my heart shattering with every step. For the first time, I felt the full magnitude of what we had done, not just to Ellie, not just to Tom, but to ourselves. And as I sat there alone, the quiet of the park pressing in around me, I knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with pain. But it was the only way forward. The weeks after I ended things with Lared were some of the hardest of my life. The weight of my choices bore down on me every second of every day. I had made the decision to stop, to put my family before my own selfish desires. But the guilt and longing didn't disappear overnight. They lingered like ghosts, haunting the quiet moments, folding laundry, cooking dinner, or lying awake at night next to Tom. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be Lared, even though I had told him we couldn't speak anymore. Each silence between us felt like a fresh wound, and yet I knew it was the only way to begin to repair the damage we had caused. I threw myself into trying to rebuild my relationship with Ellie, desperate to erase the cracks that had formed in our bond. I called her more often, visited whenever I could, and did everything in my power to be the mother she deserved. But every time I saw her smile or heard her laugh, the guilt twisted in my stomach. She didn't know the full truth, and that secret sat like a weight on my chest, suffocating any sense of peace. I knew I could never tell her, not without risking everything. But the thought of carrying this burden alone for the rest of my life felt equally unbearable. As for Lared, he and Ellie seemed to move forward as though nothing had happened. At family gatherings, he was as attentive and charming as ever, and Ellie seemed happy. But I couldn't help but wonder if she felt it. The shift in their relationship, the undercurrent of something broken that could never be fully repaired. Every glance he cast my way, every brief moment when our paths crossed, felt like a test of my resolve. I avoided him as much as I could, but avoiding him didn't make the feelings go away. If anything, it only made them harder to bury. One night, as I sat alone in the kitchen sipping coffee, I let myself reflect on everything that had happened, the mistakes, the lies, the moments of weakness that had led us here. It all felt like a bad dream, one I wished I could wake up from. But no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't change the past. All I could do was move forward, one step at a time, and try to be better for the people I loved. The weight of my actions would always be with me, a reminder of the lines I had crossed and the people I had hurt. But I resolved to carry that weight silently, to let it shape me into someone stronger, someone who could protect her family from ever enduring this kind of pain again. It was a small step toward redemption, but it was the only one I could take. Months had passed since everything unraveled, but the weight of it all still lingered like an uninvited guest in my life. I would sit alone in the kitchen each morning, the quiet hum of the coffee maker filling the silence, and reflect on how I had let things spiral so far out of control. The memories felt like scars, visible only to me but permanent reminders of the damage I had caused. No matter how much I tried to push them away, the echoes of Lared's words, his touch, and the pull between us haunted me. I wished I could rewind time, stop myself before I ever crossed that first line. But the past was unchangeable, and the only thing left to do was move forward. I had resolved to focus on my family, to be the mother and wife they needed. But the process of rebuilding was slow and painstaking. With Ellie, I worked harder than ever to strengthen our bond. Every phone call, every visit felt like a chance to prove to her, and maybe to myself, that I could still be the mother she deserved. But the guilt hung between us like an invisible curtain. Every time she mentioned Lared or shared a story about their life together, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. She didn't know the truth, and that secret became both a shield and a prison, protecting her from pain, but trapping me in my own. Tom, ever oblivious to the turmoil that had unfolded, remained the steady, kind man I had taken for granted for so long. I found myself watching him more closely, noticing the little things I had overlooked for years, the way he hummed when he read the paper, the way he always made sure my coffee cup was full before his own. These small acts of care became reminders of the life we had built together, a life I had nearly destroyed. I tried to pour my energy into our marriage, hoping to recapture the closeness we had lost over the years. But some days, the guilt made it hard to even look him in the eye. As for Lared, he and Ellie seemed happy, at least on the surface. At family gatherings, I would catch fleeting glances from him, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and regret that mirrored my own. We never spoke of what had happened, never acknowledged the storm we had weathered. But the tension between us was a constant reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. I avoided him as much as I could, hoping that with time the feelings would fade. The road ahead felt uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I could never let myself fall into that trap again. The cost was too great, the pain too unbearable. Each day became a choice to be better, to carry the weight of my actions and let it guide me toward a future where my family came first. Redemption wouldn't come easily, and perhaps not at all, but for Ellie, for Tom, and for myself, I had to try. This story is a stark reminder of the fragile lines we walk in relationships and the lasting consequences of crossing them. It teaches us that longing for what seems missing in our lives can blind us to the value of what we already have. Betrayal, even when fueled by loneliness or vulnerability, leaves scars not just on ourselves, but on those we love most. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. True strength lies in resisting temptation, cherishing the bonds that matter, and striving to nurture what's already ours. Redemption is never easy, but it's a journey worth taking for the people we hold dear.